Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show, bringing you another really fascinating guest today who is helping to create a better tomorrow for many people around the globe. Today we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Joseph Mocanu, who is managing partner of Verge HealthTech Fund, which focuses on early-stage healthcare technology company investments relevant to emerging markets. Dr. Mocanu started his career as a scientist developing new cancer therapies during his Ph.D. at the University of Toronto. He then co-founded a medical device startup during those studies, which brought him into the world of business and his first own interactions with venture capitalists. He first learned about active investing during his time at DM Capital in Shenzhen, China, helping to launch their first fund, Harmony. Then he joined Oliver Wyman's health and life sciences practice to understand and develop strategies towards addressing key business and market needs for global healthcare clients. He was involved in over 75 different projects across 20 different markets. During that time, he also assisted several funds and conglomerates with their own in-house healthcare investment strategies, ultimately seeing the need for more early stage investment for healthcare founders and the opportunity for technology to make a difference across the different markets. Dr. Mocanu began angel investing himself in healthcare companies in 2014, eventually reaching a portfolio of 9 different companies in 2018. And then he realized that he really needed to do this full time. And there really weren't a lot of dedicated funds out there focusing on seed stage health tech, addressing major global problems, which is when he decided to launch Verge HealthTech later in that year. Dr. Mocanu has a Ph.D. in medical biophysics, as mentioned, from the University of Toronto. He also has an MBA from Richard Ivers School of Business, Western University, specializing in health sector and entrepreneurship. And we're lucky to have him today. Dr. Joseph Mocanu, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thanks so much, Ira. It's an absolute pleasure. And I have to say that you absolutely nailed the introduction, probably better than anyone else I've ever heard.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. But we're going to go deeper into it, Joe. I'm going to hand things back to you as we typically do at the start of the show. You know, I'd love to go a little further into you, a little bit about what got you into medical biophysics, a little bit of that early journey, and then if you can talk a little bit about sort of your experiences in the early days. Was it the lack of companies in certain domains? Was it our so-called valley of death that we all experience in our industry? What got you interested in making that transition from academia and business into venture capital?
No, it's a great question. Maybe I can answer it in the order it was asked in a way. Sure. So I wanted to be a scientist from a very young age. I started life actually as a computer programmer. I've probably told the story too many times, but my rather strict and conservative Eastern European parents, who I love to death, when I asked them whether I could play video games like my neighbors were, they said, sure, if you make your own. And that kind of got me started in computer programming. Got the basic books from the library, copied the programs, see if they, how they work when I try to mutate them and change them a bit. And I thought that was really going to be it. I thought that was, my career. And then I had a really good biology teacher in high school who got me really quite interested in the subject. And I also really, at the same time, made the realization that we get sick and we get old and we die. And there are things that are within our power to delay and maybe even prevent a lot of this. And that got me really interested in wanting to pursue a career in science and hopefully being at the forefront of some of these new developments and cures. At the same time, I'd seen some really cool scientists spin out companies, take their innovations and make it a reality, having the ability to impact way beyond the bench and all the way, to bedside. And that was really quite inspiring. So that's really what led me to get my doctorate in medical biophysics. And there I worked on new cancer therapies and trying to image them, see where they go in various animal models and such. The transition across came as an accident, actually as a complete accident, where I was, like all grad students, looking for some side hustles to figure out how I can, upgrade my standard of living a little bit. And one of these ended up helping a medical doctor who had an interest in a brain with some computer programming challenges. And through that, we ended up accidentally inventing a real-time brain imaging system. Nice. Using EEG electrodes placed in various parts on your head. It's kind of like, the way it worked is kind of like trying to find the epicenter of an earthquake by having all these different seismographs scattered along the face of the earth. It kind of worked with a similar math, similar technology. So we had a way to image the brain in 3D 2,000 times a second using equipment that was in the magnitude at that time in tens of thousands of dollars instead of millions of dollars like you'd have with your conventional CT or MRI scanners. And, just having a great invention or just having a great product certainly isn't enough. We happened to, seek external funding in a pretty harsh macroeconomic environment. It was just after the dot-com burst. Oh, yeah. And we didn't really know enough to go to the US to try to search for some funding there. So we were looking at raising funding in a pretty barren Canadian venture capital landscape just after a huge economic crash. Mm-hmm. And really, I think the challenges of raising funding, but the realization that the funders are really shaping the future in which we live, led me to be quite interested in the world of business and more specifically in the world of investment.
Excellent. And, as I listen to that part of your story, Joe, I think about my own career a bit. I never worked in VC, but I sat across the table raising money sort of back in the same era, and things were sort of patterned in a certain way back in the late 90s, early 2000s, after going through obviously friends and family and angels, you got to your seed investors and your Series A, and then obviously went up a chain. Also had some exposure to the corporate venture capitalists, which, they were kind of like regular VCs anyway, even though they told you they would put you into their corporate system and you do all sorts of interesting stuff in there. Here we are in 2022, and you'd be forgiven if you go out on Twitter nowadays and you think that every seed round is $100 million and your Series A is $1 billion all the time, or most time. Of course. Where are we in 2022 in general? Give us sort of a lay of the land of what health tech VC, or just say life science VC overall, is all about from your perspective as a seed venture capitalist nowadays in 2022.
Yeah, so I'm gonna have to answer this with my own biases. Number
Sure.
One, where I physically invest and the stage in which I invest, plus some observations. I think as a whole, it's super exciting. I mean, there's a lot of activity. We've never understood so much about what makes the basic mechanisms of life and disease work. Mm-hmm. However, I'm investing at a stage that is somewhat, I think, immune or shielded from a lot of these macroeconomic movements that a lot of people have been talking about. I mean, number one, with probably the longest bull market in recent memory, and then some of the corrections around what happened, I guess, at the start of the year. I'm not quite sure how that's going to overall affect the venture capital scene in the near future. I think for my particular segment, I think it's not going to affect it very much, to be honest. There's an article I came across just recently that did a retroactive analysis on impact of valuations on different macroeconomic cycles, and depending on what stage you are in your investment, be it seed, pre-seed, Series A, and so on. And it's really once you start getting to like Series D and E, Series C and D and beyond, that you start to see a little bit of ripple effects going on. I think what would be more interesting is what would happen in terms of the companies that are exiting now and then are looking for like second order support from the current round of startups, to see whether in fact what's coming up is in line or matching with what innovation is needed to bolt on to some of these companies that are really just recently debuting out there in the public markets. But again, I'm not a late stage person.
Right.
I'm sitting over on the other side of the planet in Singapore, focusing a lot on emerging markets, and I think that there's a lot of other factors that need to be taken into consideration.
And segueing to that, you are an emerging market investor, as you were just mentioning, and once again, thinking back to the day, I could have been raising money in Pennsylvania and reached out to a fund in New Jersey, and they're like, no, we don't invest in Pennsylvania, but you're kind of everywhere. You have investments in Vietnam, you have investments in Colombia, you span the globe. Talk a little bit about sort of some of the trends that you saw when you're setting up the fund, specifically in these emerging markets. We have the same trends in terms of sickness and people getting old, but then there's wealthier people as well now, and there's this demand. Talk about your strategy as it pertains specifically to being a sort of a global emerging market investor.
Yeah, so I mean, fundamentally, why we are global is really to be able to source, the greatest innovations around the world and arbitrage them to a place where they're also needed the most. And sometimes this is the same market, sometimes this is not the same market. And in order to be able to invest globally, we need a few things. Like, firstly, we need to have a consensus view as to what are some of the common challenges in health systems, common challenges in human health that need to be overcome. What are some of the major trends? What are some of the major inefficiencies that we see across multiple healthcare systems? Because of course, one of the challenges with venture is you still need, when you invest in a company, for the potential for that company to return the fund.
Sure.
Right. So there still needs to be an economic case for this. It's not like you can put in millions of dollars in a very small market in a very small disease area and expect a unicorn to come out of it. And we honestly don't hunt for unicorns. We hunt for just good solutions to really big problems, which I define as both breadth as in number of people and depth as in the degree of seriousness of the problem. So if a billion people have slightly itchy skin versus 10 million people having a life or death malady, I'd definitely take the latter of it versus the former. So some common themes, I think fundamentally, no matter where you are in the world, developed or developing, you have a mismatch of supply and demand, in that you have demand for healthcare growing for different reasons. Some are structural, some are demographic, some are socioeconomic, but for whatever reason, you have demand that's growing, and largely, universally, it's due to aging populations and the rise of non-communicable diseases, which go hand in hand, actually. The urbanization of lifestyles, that's a pretty global phenomenon, also contributing to this. And then one of the challenges that you have is that you don't have, in emerging markets, you don't have enough healthcare professionals or hard infrastructure to address the demand today, let alone the growing demand tomorrow. And in a lot of countries, there's just been chronic underinvestment in all of the above in order to enable this demand to be met. So you have to do things a little bit differently. In developed markets, one of the things that you have is an increase in dependency ratio, and in fact a shrinking of the potential coverage of, I guess, working age healthcare providers that can address an increasingly large elderly population, plus governments that are increasingly in debt and need to cut from somewhere. But fundamentally, you still have this supply-demand mismatch. And so we look for things that will alleviate that. So for example, if you can reduce demand by increasing prevention. Like if there are things that you can do that prevent the people from getting sick and needing to seek some sort of care, that's one thing that you can do. A second thing that you can do is at least try to manage the severity or the intensity of the illness. So this is, where you do things like chronic disease management to make sure that they don't escalate to a point where they need to be hospitalized, that they can be managed in their homes or by a general practitioner. And then on the supply side, like we're not in the business of building hospitals. We don't have time to build hospitals. We don't have time to train physicians. But what we can do is make them more efficient. Mm-hmm. Or make the process more efficient. So those are the broad themes that we look at, and everything has to involve technology at the core, because throwing more warm bodies at the problem is not going to solve this when you don't have enough warm bodies.
Yep. You have a fascinating portfolio, and I don't intend for you to go into all of it, but I just thought we'd touch on a couple themes that we've discussed on the show, and you can walk through some of the areas that you're most excited about. And obviously, one of the ones that sticks out, artificial intelligence. We've done a lot on that in the show in recent months. I saw this one investment you made in terms of the artificial intelligence-powered stethoscopes and their ability to sort of look at various lung diseases. Obviously, last couple of years, we've been in the midst of a pretty nasty acute lung disease, but asthma and everything else in terms of the chronic diseases of the lung as well are still out there. Talk a little bit about this, if you would, in terms of sort of artificial intelligence in general and how you look at that sort of a core technology, and then a little bit about this particular investment, if you would.
Yeah, so I'm happy to say more on this. And this is it right here for those on the YouTube stream. This is the world's most intelligent and affordable digital stethoscope, at least to my best knowledge. And so, the story of this, I think it's like a textbook case of both frugal innovation and the concept of, quality care at a distance. And one that's extremely accessible to everyone. So the story of this is that the founder of this company is actually from Minsk, Belarus. So, we do invest in some exotic locations. So this founder, so her daughter had a chronic cough, and she'd go to different physicians and get different answers. And that was not very satisfying, and it was actually quite traumatic for the child because she developed a fear of physicians, unfortunately, as a consequence. And so the founder then asked, is it not possible to use, machine learning to try to identify some of the key lung sounds better than, physicians can? So she did a little bit of research on PubMed and found that indeed it is theoretically possible. But how do you make it better? How do you make it something that can be applied for a wider audience and something that's robust? So the first thing, the first rule of AI is garbage in, garbage out. Mm-hmm. So what they did first is ask themselves, how do we get the highest quality lung sound data, the annotated lung sound data in the world? So then, I'll turn the question to you. What kind of physician do you think would provide the greatest input data, the greatest classification of input data?
Assuming a pulmonologist in this case, but
Yeah, exactly. A pulmonologist, but what kind of pulmonologist? Because it's not enough to have the brain of the pulmonologist, but what else do you need? And I don't usually do this, putting the host on the spot.
I'm gonna pediatric pulmonologist. I mean, I'm trying to think about these 5 lung diseases and everything, but go ahead, educate us. Sorry.
You want a pulmonologist with really good hearing.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And the kind of pulmonologist that has the best hearing are pulmonologists who are trained in classical music. So this is where, the part of the world that they're from initially, perceived as a disadvantage, turns out to be a competitive barrier, because where else are you going to have access to pulmonologists who are classically trained in music, who can, really create the highest quality lung sound data set in the world. And they sampled tens of thousands of lung sounds and ended up with an AI that could, come up with accuracy rates in the mid-90s for fine or coarse bronchi, wheezes, and crackles. And, I think some of the audience might be aware that pneumonia is the leading killer of children under the age of 6. And I'm sure we're all aware of, COVID induced pneumonia, which is, claimed the lives of millions around the world to date, and countless more disabled. And so this is something that could really, really make a difference in the world, but it all stemmed from a mother trying to solve a problem for her daughter. And because they were quite resource constrained, they had to do things very, very efficiently. The first prototype that I saw from them when I first met them at a tech conference in Finland was a foam brick with a wire sticking out of it. But it worked. Actually worked really well, and the bill of materials was like $1. I'm probably exaggerating a little bit. And then next came the 3D printed prototype. Next came, our investment. The investment of a manufacturer of a consumer medical device company in Germany, a VC in Germany, and then now they have a product that is selling in the former Soviet republics, and they just got their FDA exemption. So maybe we'll start seeing some physicians using this device in rural settings in the U.S. Hopefully, they'll also get their 510(k) later this year. It should be fairly straightforward.
Excellent. I love seeing things like this come full circle, make it to the market and the sort of the transition, and it's a fascinating case.
And what it does, I'll just add one last thought on this, is that one of the unfortunate challenges with lung auscultation is that when your ears are really good, you tend to be young and inexperienced, and then when you are very experienced at identifying the sounds through time and decades of practice, and your ears aren't very good anymore. So what this does, we're not trying to replace doctors here. We're just trying to make them smarter. We're trying to turn them basically into cyborgs, or kind of giving them superhuman hearing.
Awesome. Joe, one of the areas that it focused a bit on the show in recent months has been this emerging area of longevity bioscience, biotechnological gerontology, whatever you want to call it. And obviously, this is an area, healthy aging, health span, that is tough to measure because your clinical trials, if you do things the old school way, are going to have to go out 20 years and so forth and so on, or more. Exactly. I noticed a few of your investments, really interesting. One that had to do with continuous monitoring of I think up to 9 different biomarkers. You have another investment in terms of health diagnostics that looks at heart rate variability and other criteria. Once again, very important in sort of the health span, healthy aging area. Talk a little bit about some of these investments, if you would, and then do you see the theme in some of these emerging markets as we do locally of longevity biotechnologies coming as an interesting segment of the biotech scene?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll briefly flash the first investment that you talked about, and it's kind of funny that you literally picked the companies which I happen to have sitting on my desk, because I was describing our portfolio to another fund that's a little bit later stage than us. Trying to be the good, responsible VC and passing along the baton. So this one, ironically, was not really looking to do all this continuous biomarker measurement for the purposes of, monitoring and extending health span. It was really trying to objectively measure pain, which is one of the leading causes of disability in a lot of places around the world. We know the opioid epidemic in the US is a pretty serious one. You probably didn't know that the leading cause of disability in Indonesia, example, is lower back pain, or was it upper back pain? But in any case, that was a surprise to me when I read the stats on healthdata.org. So the objective continuous measurement of pain is a pretty significant one. However, I will go back to answer your question in that the answer around longevity is not just a rich world problem, because if you look at, one of the biggest fears of a lot of societies is that they get old before they get rich. And what do you do if, 30% of your population is over the age of 65, but you haven't even reached middle income status as a country yet, or you don't have a strong social security net, or your healthcare system is strained as it is. What do you do? So you need to keep people as healthy for as long as possible for the sake of keeping a productive society in order. And, you know, the last thing we want to see is people working really hard and toiling in, you know, menial jobs into the 80s or 90s. But conversely, you know, if there's a way that their experience and value to society can compound over time, that would only do a society better. The last thing you want to see is a hospital filled with elderly people and, you know, having only one doctor per 1,000 people. Yeah, so it is topical. And then the other thing I'll refer to, I guess, a bit of a hero of mine, and I think a hero of many these days, David Sinclair, who in his book Lifespan, there was a really compelling chart that showed the incidence of chronic disease as a function of time.
Oh, yeah.
And guess what? Like, the older you got, the more these diseases went up, and especially after the age of like 40 or 50. So if you can maintain the health of someone in their 40s well into your 60s and 70s, and you are seeing this. I mean, you're seeing, you know, high performance athletes who are performing still at championship level in their 40s, which is something that was unheard of 20 or 30 years ago. There is certainly hope. And I do hope that a lot of these innovations in nutrition, lifestyle, supplements will trickle down. And yes, there will, of course, be the biotechnological solutions that will replace our, you know, damaged organs or atherosclerotic hearts and whatnot. But there's a lot of things you can do well before that.
Yep. And let's hop into one of those, because another hot topic is this, called this sort of the silver tsunami of Alzheimer's and dementia that is headed every country's way. And you know, unlike heart disease and cancer, which may kill more people, but which we have some solutions for nowadays, we're doing, I say we, as the sort of the biopharmaceutical space is doing pretty poorly with regard to Alzheimer's. You have one investment where, you know, you try to look at Alzheimer's years before with the interesting retinal scans. But then there was another thing, I don't know if it's connected, but if you want to talk about it too. You know, I just did this episode with folks from AARP here in the United States, and one of the areas you don't think about, but hearing loss and the connection to dementia and the ability. But when that starts not hearing things and missing out on things, there's this strange feedback connection to memory and not remembering those things because you're not hearing them. And I forget, the number was staggering. Just if we just gave hearing aids to people. Now you have some other interesting technologies regarding, you know, people that are embarrassed to wear hearing aids. Talk a little bit about this. I don't know if you have a connection to dementia in it in your investment, but
no,
talk about this.
There absolutely is. Okay. There absolutely is. So one of my earliest angel investments really educated me on the hearing loss space, which I was pretty ignorant. Actually, I have to give full credit to my wife, who discovered this startup when I sent her to some conferences while I was still busy at work. They were doing early hearing screening and testing in emerging markets. They were replacing, you know, the typical setup that an audiologist had with a calibrated headset and a tablet, and it was fully functionally equivalent. And I didn't realize that hearing loss had so many impacts on society, you know, at an early age, with learning development, in the workforce with workplace safety, and then in old age, as you just mentioned, with dementia. And I suspect it has something to do with the resilience of the brain when you have more connections. You know, you'll find that people that are college educated, you know, seem to develop Alzheimer's later in life. And perhaps it's due to the increased interconnection of the neurons that creates more redundancy or buffer until the damage is pretty much terminal. So you'll find that and I wish I had some sort of, you know, whiteboard to show this on, but you'll see that with people who are perhaps less educated or don't use their brain as much, the decline is linear over time, whereas people who are highly educated maintain a certain level of function and, you know, cascade suddenly, but they have more years of cognitive, normalcy or apparent cognitive normalcy than the other group. I suspect this is what's happening when you deprive your brain of a key stimulus. You're not having those connections reinforced, and that's why it probably happens a bit more. I'd be interested to see whether that's been proven or not. So getting more hearing aids in people is super important, but I'd say that an equally, if not more important thing is to be able to determine whether you are at risk of Alzheimer's, 10 to 20 years in advance of symptoms, because by the time you have symptoms, you have catastrophic brain damage.
Yeah.
When you show symptoms, you have to regrow brain in order to, make yourself whole again. And Alzheimer's is one of the most terrifying diseases I've ever encountered, because in a way you lose your soul. You lose who you are. And the effect on the people around you is devastating. It's like losing a loved one in slow motion. And anything that we can do to prevent or delay this disease should be, a major priority. So while there was a lot of controversy around aducanumab and other efforts, we have to try. Yeah. But one of the things that ReadySpec does, which I think is super cool, is and super impactful, is they have proven with their latest abstract that was released at CTAD that they can detect asymptomatic amyloid positive patients, which means you have time to do something. Because there have been studies in Finland, like the FINGER study, an EU Commission study called the Lipidi Diet Study, and I think there was a cohort study done by the NHS that showed that lifestyle, diet, and behavior, sleep, can certainly have an impact in delaying or even preventing. And there are things that you can, eat when it comes to, different kinds of fatty acids and lipids that you could actually prevent or slow down at least the onset of Alzheimer's, which is pretty amazing. And I suspect one reason the pharmaceutical industry has utterly failed in their efforts to develop an Alzheimer's therapeutic is because they're limited to recruiting patients that are somewhat symptomatic, and by then you're too late. Or if you want to get asymptomatic patients, you have to invest a ton of money in screening them for, signs of the amyloid plaques, but without actual cognitive symptoms. And this is where ReadySpec can make a really big immediate difference, in identifying those early patients. And then secondly, imagine going to your eye doctor, and then as part of your routine checkup, you say, well, your amyloid signal is a little bit higher than normal. That's been associated with an earlier onset of Alzheimer's. Good news is it's still really early. There are things you can do about it. And so in resource poor environments, what you're probably going to have to do is really emphasize these lifestyle changes. And then the more wealthier markets, you can take the pill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's Jay, you have a fascinating portfolio, and it's just there's elegance to it, and I really appreciate that as a sort of an outsider, looking at how you've thought through some of these investments. And I will put up the link to, of course, in the bio, so everyone listening and watching can take a look at some of these companies. Joe, I'd love to just get your thoughts on some of the other stuff that's happening in the industry, or sort of tangential to it in general, because obviously here we are once again, as mentioned at the beginning, sort of in 2022, rounds look different, the type of investors out there look different, and then there's a bunch of other models. We see things like crowdfunding, like crypto, like prize models. Talk a little bit about, just from your perspective there, what of these things has legs? What doesn't? What are you excited about? What do you think is junk? And at the same time, I'd love to get sort of a second part of that. I'd love to get your perspective on, I won't call it the dumb money, but it's sort of the ultra rich money that comes in this space. And it just happened recently. I don't know if you paid attention to Jeff Bezos and his recent $3 billion investment in a company called Altos that's doing cellular reprogramming. Love to get your
Yeah,
thoughts on.
factors.
Yeah, because I follow this space. Full disclosure, I'm sort of involved in it myself. But when you have 10 companies out there that are doing that already, that are sort of traditional companies like you might have in your portfolio, does it help or does it hinder when there's a 11th company that has $3 billion behind it? And I'd love to get your thoughts on these matters as well.
Ooh, that's a really, really good question. I think one of the challenges that ties both of your questions together is the concept of signal to noise.
Okay.
That is something that we're really, really going to have to deal with. And something that I'm seeing more and more is, because of the pandemic, I think this is a good thing overall. A lot of people are starting to really focus on doing things in healthcare. I think you have a Cambrian explosion of innovation, across like pretty much every facet of healthcare right now. The challenge with all of this is that there's going to be a great extinction at some point, because not all of these can be very successful, multinational companies that generate billions in revenue. Some will have a really great impact. Some might find their home in a larger team. There might be a roll up happening, but it's certainly made things a bit more complicated. Now, to address the two questions around the quote unquote dumb money, although I would argue that Jeff Bezos is really, really smart. I just don't know how good he is at biotech.
Sure.
I'm sure he has some pretty smart people advising him, but the question is valid because you do have a lot of non-traditional investors coming into this space at both ends, actually at multiple fronts. So if we start with this one, the family wealth, or the founder that's been really, really successful and wants to apply it somewhere else.
Yep.
That can work out really, really well because they can invest in a project that maybe was not popular but is needed. Maybe a financial return isn't what they're looking for. Maybe they're looking for an advance in science, looking out for the betterment of humanity, looking out for social impact. Who knows? Or maybe they just really think it's cool and that's just what they want to do. I think that's okay. I think where it becomes dangerous is when they start getting involved in other companies and maybe they start, how shall I say, like altering the trajectory of what could have been a really good solution, or maybe mispricing an asset so that the pressure to catch up to that price distracts the leadership from doing their job. Yep. I think those are some of the risks that I have personally seen in the space. I'm not going to name names, but you see some very large and high profile biotech companies that have been valued at insane valuations, where you actually don't have any industry capital participating in that company. And that's usually something that I see as a red flag. Even at the early stages, I do look at it as kind of like a yellow card sort of thing. Now, if we go all the way to the other end, where you have the crowdfunding, the crypto, all that sort of stuff, again, in principle, I'm for it because not enough early innovation gets funded. But the challenge, of course, is ensuring that the appropriate due diligence is done for two reasons. Because, if a lot of things get funded that shouldn't have been funded, then you crowd out the legitimate projects that should have received the target of the next round funding. And because maybe this founder that is telling a really good story, but doesn't necessarily have a lot of substance, will get funding ahead of the project that perhaps has a lot of substance, but maybe a not so good storyteller founder. Cases of that will happen more frequently. The other concern is, I guess what happened in, where I'm from in Canada originally, when I grew up, where you had a lot of excitement over biotech, and a lot of retail participation in early stage biotech investments through what were called labor-sponsored investment funds. And these basically blew up and burned a lot of fingers where people didn't want to touch the sector for a good amount of time. And I think, with my own entrepreneurship experience, we were at the tail end of that blow up. So what could happen is, a bunch of retail investors get their fingers burned and they don't want to touch it for a long, long time, which is, also really, really bad for the industry. I don't know if I gave a conclusive enough answer here, but these are just some of the concerns that I've observed. Specifically addressing the 11th player in a crowded space. I think it really depends. It really depends on whether they're truly unique or not, or maybe they can act as a giant black hole and act as a consolidator to basically pool everyone's resources together. Is that fair for the founders who just found themselves competing against someone 3,000 times their size? Maybe, maybe not, depending on whether they exited nicely.
Sure.
But is it good for the field? Probably. The unfortunate part of it is I can't think of too many examples of companies with a $3 billion seed round that succeeded.
Neither can I. But we'll wait and we'll see. No, but I appreciate you sort of giving your thoughts on these matters, and I totally respect. I think you hit every angle there on what we should all be looking at when we see these things happen, whether it's the $3 billion rounds or the novel sort of seed models. But no, that was great. I really appreciate those insights as well.
Well, don't get me wrong. I want everyone to be successful because I don't want to die.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Yeah. We're on the same page with that one.
Or at least of causes external to my own decision, perhaps. Who knows?
18-wheel trucks, fine. I'm with you. I'm with you. One other thing I wanted to ask you about and get a little of your thoughts on is certainly for the sort of the next generation that's going to be watching and listening to our episode. I spent time in the pharma industry, and whether it was you wanted to be involved in business development or MRA or whatever you wanted to get involved in there. They wanted you, nonetheless, to have some sales experience. They wanted you to understand the customer. At the end of the day, you were developing these products for. You didn't always want to do sales, but you had to do it. I'm talking to you, scientist, entrepreneur, venture capitalist, somebody just coming out of business school tomorrow. They want to be the next Dr. Joe Mocanu, want to be a venture capitalist. Do you encourage people to get into VC at an early age, or do you tell them, look, this is great, but you got to get out there and get experience in the lab. You got to get experience running a company, working for a company before you come into this thing? Or do you occasionally run into somebody that's really damn smart and you say, I gotta have you on my my team as an associate investment partner, whatever. What do you see nowadays, and what do you suggest for that next generation that's listening that wants to be you?
It's funny. When I finished business school, I tried to get a job in VC, and I remember speaking to a venture capitalist, describing kind of like my life story up until that point, and then he said to me, Joseph, you're too young to be a VC. Now, I actually think that there are multiple paths. There are multiple roads to Rome. If I were to go back and do things again, I probably would have wanted to work for a large company. Probably would have wanted to do my consulting career a little bit earlier when I had a little bit more energy, because consulting, unfortunately, is a young person's game. The 120-hour weeks, when you're doing that in your late 30s, that's not fun. But when you're doing it at age 21, that's a different set of constitution, and your ability to learn and accumulate skills and experience is really quite unparalleled. And I might have done the PhD after that. I know that sounds kind of really weird. I know a handful of consultants who have done that and successfully, or done medical school after consulting, because it does provide a really it's kind of a practical MBA. I almost feel like if you do consulting, you don't need to do an MBA unless you just want to get the logo of the nice school and make a bunch of friends. Right. you do really look at all different functions here. But you could actually start really young as a VC, as an associate. I wouldn't want to work up the pyramid, though. I do think that in between, before you become a VC partner, you have to do something else. One of the things I do notice is that a lot of associates lack empathy because they have never raised money. They have never struggled. Whereas a lot of entrepreneurs, they could be doing something else with their life. They could, be making, easily a 6-figure, sometimes 7-figure salary working for a big corporate with the skill set that they have. But no, they've chosen to give it all up to pursue a dream, and to be ghosted or treated rudely by junior staff who have a chip on their shoulder is really, really unfortunate. And I think it's not good. So having a bit of real world experience and a bit of struggle, I think is really good before becoming a VC. Also, you get a sense of what good looks like, and I find that you learn a lot more from mistakes than successes.
Mm-hmm.
And being a consultant, being an entrepreneur, that gives you an opportunity to make a lot of mistakes.
Excellent points. Yeah, Joe, it's you had a fascinating journey. This portfolio was awesome, and I'm going to be rooting you on as you continue, not just with these investments, but everything else, because I think you're in a fascinating area that's got so much potential behind it. For everybody that is going to be listening to this particular episode across the podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Dr. Joseph Mocanu, managing partner, Verge HealthTech Fund in Singapore, doing really amazing things, investing in novel early stage healthcare tech companies relevant to both emerging markets and to all of us ultimately. Joe, I want to thank you for taking the time to come on the show and sharing your knowledge with all of us. Obviously, thank you for everything you're doing there through your investments. And as we say on this show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for everybody through what you're doing. It's a really fascinating story. And I say again, wishing you the best with all of your portfolio and everything else you're going to be going into.
Thanks so much, Ira, for having me. It's been a real pleasure sharing my experiences, and hopefully it inspires more people to try to do something about our healthcare, because there's a lot that needs to be done still.
Most definitely. Most definitely. Be well.